Jules Henderson first knew something had changed when the women at the dry goods counter stopped talking the moment she reached for the coffee beans. Not because she'd said a word, she rarely did in public, but because of the way their eyes slid past her and landed on the front windows, waiting for a rider to appear. A man had come to town the day before. A decent worker by the look of him, the kind who sat straight in the saddle and didn't waste motion. And by sundown, Red Willow was already certain of what he wanted. Not a job, not a fresh start. A wife. Jules kept her face calm while her fingers counted coins. She pretended not to feel the heat behind her ears, pretended not to hear her name drifting through the store like dust in a sunbeam. Belinda, one woman said, soft and sure. It'll be Belinda. Jules swallowed. She knew why they said it. Everyone did. Belinda belonged in bright rooms. She laughed easily. She remembered people's birthdays, asked after their mothers, and wore ribbons that made even hard-faced men soften their voices. When Belinda stepped into a space, folks made room without thinking. Jules was the space people tried not to notice. She carried her purchases out into the street with steady hands. Outside, Red Willow looked the same as it always had. A long strip of sun-baked buildings, porch posts scarred by boot heels, horses shifting in the heat, and the wind always moving as if it had somewhere better to be. Yet something in the town felt newly arranged, like furniture moved in the dark. At home, the Henderson house sat just beyond the busy part of town, with a small yard that refused to be green no matter how Jules coaxed it. Her father had built the place back when Red Willow still believed it might become important. Now it was just a stubborn home holding its ground. Belinda was on the front steps when Jules arrived, fanning herself with a folded paper and smiling at nothing in particular. "You took your time," Belinda said, light as a teasing song. "The line was long," Jules replied. Belinda's gaze flicked to the bag in Jules's arms. "You didn't need to carry all that." Jules didn't answer. Belinda always spoke as if offering help was the same as giving it. She wasn't cruel, not exactly. She just moved through life like it was made to part for her. Inside, their father sat at the table with a ledger open and his spectacles low on his nose. He looked older this summer, not weak. Mr. Henderson didn't know how to be weak, but worn in the way a fence post looked after too many storms. He tapped the ledger with a thick finger. "Belinda says the new hand is already asking questions." Belinda's smile sharpened. Not questions, just polite talk. Polite talk is how a man takes measure of a place. Jules set the supplies down and washed her hands at the basin. The water ran rusty at first, then cleared. She kept her eyes on the bowl. "What kind of man is he?" her father asked, like Jules might know from the shape of the wind. Jules dried her hands. "I saw him once, outside the livery." Belinda's tone turned sweet. "He's quiet, but not shy. He has a way of looking right through a person, like he's reading something." That made Jules glance up. Belinda was watching her, not her father. Jules' stomach tightened. "What's his name?" "Josh," Belinda said as if the name belonged on a sign. "Josh Henderson." Jules' fingers went still on the towel. Henderson. Their father's brows lifted. No relation. He said his mother's people were Hendersons back east. He's coming from Kansas. Jules felt a strange pull in her chest, not quite fear, not quite interest, more like an old bruise pressed by accident. A man didn't just carry a name into a town already full of it without trouble, even if he meant no harm. Their father closed the ledger. "If he's looking for work, I can offer him a wage. We need hands if we're going to keep up with the North pasture."
Belinda leaned her elbows on the back of a chair.
"He didn't come here for pasture work." Jules's mouth went dry. "How do you know?" Belinda's eyes gleamed with the kind of confidence Jules never understood. "Because he asked about us, our family," their father said. "About the house," Belinda replied. "About you, about—" She paused, just long enough to make Jules feel the pause, like a hand on her shoulder. The girls. Their father stared at the table, thinking. In the silence, The kitchen clock sounded louder than it had any right to. Finally, he said, "Well, if he's a respectable man, he'll speak plain." Belinda smiled again, bright as her ribbon. "He will?" Jules kept her face smooth. She carried dishes to the shelf. She swept crumbs. She did all the small tasks that let a person avoid being seen thinking too hard. Still, the town's certainty pressed in on her from every side. Josh would choose Belinda. Why wouldn't he? Jules had learned long ago not to hold expectations like they were something safe. Expectations were what you reached for right before they pulled away. That evening, Belinda dressed for supper as if the meal might be watched. She pinned her hair with care, smoothed her skirt, and dabbed a little rose water behind her ears. "You're not going anywhere," Jules said before she could stop herself. Belinda turned, amused. "No, but if a man comes calling, I won't look like I crawled out of the flour sack." Jules stared at her sister's reflection in the small mirror. For a moment, she saw what everyone else saw: ease, brightness, the kind of beauty that didn't ask permission. Then she saw the flicker underneath it, quick and hidden. Hunger, fear, the need to win before someone else could. Jules looked away. After supper, the sky turned the color of old copper. Their father stepped onto the porch with his pipe, and Belinda followed, lingering where she'd be visible from the road. Jules stayed inside. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she had mending to do. She told herself 100 things that weren't the full truth. The truth was simpler. She didn't want to watch. When hoofbeats finally sounded, they were slow and deliberate, not hurried, not unsure. Jules's needle paused mid-stitch. Her father's voice came through the screen door, low. "Evening." Another voice answered, male, steady. "Evening, sir." Then, after a moment, "I hope I'm not calling too late." Belinda's laugh floated in, gentle as a bell. "Not at all." Jules held her breath without meaning to. Footsteps creaked across the porch boards. A shadow crossed the window. Jules kept her eyes on her hands, but she could feel the presence of someone standing just beyond the doorway, like the air itself had grown heavier. "Mr. Bosca said." "Henderson," the man said. "I'd like a word, if you'll allow it." Their father replied, cautious. "Go on." There was a pause, the kind that made Jules's skin prickle. "I came to Red Willow for honest work," the man said. "And for something else besides." Belinda didn't speak. Jules could imagine her smile fixed in place, waiting for the moment the world did what it always did. Josh continued, calm enough to be dangerous. "I'm asking permission to court your daughter." Jules felt the needle slip and prick her finger. A bead of blood rose bright against her skin. Belinda's voice came, soft and triumphant. "Well, that's forward." Jules pressed her thumb to the prick, breathing carefully. Then Josh spoke again. "It is, but I won't waste your time." Another pause. Longer. "And I'm not asking for Belinda." The house seemed to tilt, just slightly, as if the words had shifted the whole foundation. Belinda made a small sound, half laugh, half breath, like she hadn't heard right. Their father said nothing at first. Josh's boots moved, not away, closer to the door. "Miss Jules," he called, not loud but certain. "If you'll come out, I'd rather ask you straight." Jules stared at her bloodied thumb, the cloth beneath it turning red. Her heart beat hard enough to make her ears ring. Belinda's voice sharpened. "Jules? Don't." But her father's tone cut through, unfamiliar and stern. "Jules, come here." Jules set the sewing down with shaking hands. She stood slowly, as if standing too fast might make this vanish. She opened the door. Josh Henderson stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. He wasn't dressed fancy. His shirt was clean but plainly worn. His face was sun-browned, his jaw rough with the day's growth, his eyes the steady gray of river stone. He looked at Jules the way a man looked at a thing he'd already decided mattered, without hurry, without performance. And for the first time in years, Jules didn't know where to put her hands. "I'm sorry to bring this to your doorstep," Josh said, voice quiet. "But I've learned doors are the only place folks can't pretend they don't see you." Jules' throat tightened. Belinda stood behind their father, pale now, her ribbon suddenly too bright. Josh swallowed once, then held Jules' gaze. "Miss Jules," he said, "I came to ask for your hand in marriage." Jules felt the world go silent except for the wind. The town had told her how this would go. Her sister had dressed for it. Even Jules had braced herself for it. But Josh's eyes didn't look uncertain. They looked resolved. Jules' lips parted, but no sound came. Because one question rose higher than all the rest, hot and aching and impossible to ignore. Why her? And before she could ask it, Josh's fingers tightened around the small object he'd kept hidden in his coat pocket, like whatever it was had brought him here. And whatever it was would change everything if it came into the light. The porch stayed frozen in a kind of hush that didn't belong to summer evenings. Jules could feel her father watching her like he was trying to decide if she was about to do something foolish or brave. Behind him, Belinda stood very still, her mouth slightly open as if she'd been interrupted mid-breath and couldn't find her way back to it. Josh's hat was held to his chest, not as a performance, but as if he needed something steady in his hands. Jules tried to speak. Nothing came out at first. Then, quietly, she managed, "You don't know me." Josh didn't flinch at that. "I know enough." Belinda found her voice like a match striking. Enough for what? For marriage? Josh's gaze flicked once toward Belinda, polite but firm, and returned to Jules. "Enough to know what kind of woman you are when nobody's clapping." Jules felt the words land on her like warm water and didn't know whether to be grateful or suspicious. Her father cleared his throat. "This is—" He seemed to search for a word that didn't exist. Unexpected, Josh nodded. "Yes, sir." "And sudden," her father added. "Yes, sir." Belinda stepped forward, too close, as if she could physically reshape the moment. "If you're looking for a wife with standing in Red Willow, you're making a mistake." Jules's stomach tightened. She'd heard Belinda cut people down with honeyed edges before. She'd never expected to be the one under the blade. Josh didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm not looking for standing," he said. "I'm looking for someone I can build a steady life with." Belinda laughed once, sharp. Steady with her. Pride rose up, old and stubborn, and she hated it for showing itself now of all times. Josh's eyes never left hers. "I'm not here to insult anyone." Her father lifted a hand. "Belinda, enough." Belinda's chin tipped up. "He asked her on purpose, father. He's doing it on purpose." That was the first thing Jules agreed with, and it frightened her. Jules forced her voice to stay even. "Why?" Josh's thumb pressed against the inside of his coat where that hidden object sat like a stone. "I'd rather speak with you alone," he said. Belinda's laugh came again, smaller and meaner. "So you can convince her? Like she's a child?" Josh looked over Jules's shoulder toward the yard, as if measuring the town beyond it. "So I can be honest without feeding gossip." Her father stared at Josh for a long moment. Then he said, "Jules." Jules turned, expecting an order. Her father's eyes were tired. "If you want to send him away, say it plain," he said. "And if you want to hear him out, then hear him out. But do it with sense." Belinda's voice softened into something that sounded like concern until you listened closely. "Jules, don't embarrass yourself." Jules' hands curled at her sides. She didn't look at Belinda. She looked at Josh. "All right," Jules said. The word came out steadier than she felt. "But not inside, out back, where the porch light doesn't make a show of it." Josh's shoulders eased the smallest amount. "Yes, ma'am." Belinda made a sound of protest, but their father's stare stopped it. Jules walked around the side of the house, the dry grass whispering against her skirt. Josh followed at a respectful distance, boots quiet in the dirt. Behind them, the porch boards creaked once, Belinda shifting, restless. Out back, the air smelled of dust and cooling wood. The Hendersons kept a small bench near the wash line, and Jules sat on the far end like she needed room to breathe. Josh stayed standing. Jules didn't waste time. "Tell me why you said that." Josh's jaw worked once, Because I meant it. Dipped. That isn't an answer. His eyes lifted to hers. There was tiredness in them that didn't match his age. I came here with a purpose, he said, and the purpose involves your family. Jules felt a cold thread run through her chest. My family? Josh reached inside his coat, slow enough not to startle her, and pulled out the object he'd been touching. Not a weapon, not money, a letter, creased at the folds, sealed once, and opened and sealed again with careful hands. Alongside it, a small keepsake, a thin silver thimble, worn smooth at the edges, the kind a woman might carry for years. Jules stared at it as if it might bite. Josh held them out but didn't force them into her hands. These belonged to someone in Red Willow. Josh's gaze dropped to the thimble. Josh's gaze dropped to the thimble. A woman who sewed for a living. A woman who left town in a hurry. Jules's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. A memory stirred, dim but sharp at the corners. A woman in the back pew of church, hands always busy. A soft voice. A sudden absence people stopped mentioning. Jules forced herself to speak. Why are you bringing me this? Josh's voice turned rougher, like the words scraped on the way out. Because I was supposed to bring it years ago. Jules blinked. Years. He nodded. I was a boy, running errands for men who didn't care what they carried as long as it paid. Her pulse thudded. You're not from Kansas.
I've been there, Josh said carefully.
But I'm not from there. Jules's breath caught. It wasn't the lie that stung. It was the ease with which he'd let her father believe it. So you come here, she said, slow, with a letter and a thimble, and you ask me to marry you. Josh's mouth tightened. Yes, that makes no sense.
It will, he said quietly.
If you let it. Jules leaned forward, anger warming her spine. Don't talk like that. Don't talk like I'm supposed to be grateful you noticed me. Josh flinched then. Just once, a crack in his calm. I'm not asking you because no one else would, he said. I'm asking you because you're the only one in that house who has lived with people's judgment and still kept your hands clean. Jules laughed once, bitter. Clean? You don't know what they say about me.
I've heard, Josh said. That made her go still.
From who? He hesitated. It was a small thing, but it widened the space between them. Jules' voice sharpened. From Belinda. Josh didn't answer right away, and that was answer enough. Jules stood so fast the bench creaked. Of course. Jules. No, she said, heat rising into her face. You come in here carrying old things and old secrets, and you take your understanding of me from the one person who benefits from my humiliation. Josh's hand tightened around the letter. I didn't come here for Belinda. But you spoke with her, Jules snapped. You let her believe… What? That she could guide you? Josh's gaze lifted, steady again. I spoke with her because she spoke to me first. And because in a town like this, a man doesn't get answers unless he listens to whoever is willing to talk. Jules stared at him. Answers about what? About the night everything changed for your family. The words punched air out of her lungs. Jules' voice dropped. What do you know about that night? Josh looked past her, toward the back fence where the yard ended and the empty land began. Enough to know that people have been blaming the wrong person. Jules felt her throat tighten. You don't get to say that. I do, he said, and his calm was gone now, replaced by something determined. Because I was there. You were a boy, Josh said. Small enough to be overlooked, useful enough to be used. Jules heard her own heartbeat. The yard seemed too open, too exposed. You're lying, she said, but it didn't sound certain. Josh shook his head once. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not proud of what I didn't do. Jules's hands trembled, and she hated them for it. Then why are you here? Josh looked at her like the answer cost him. Because I owe a debt, he said. And because the person who should have been protected wasn't. Jules' breath came shallow. Who? Josh's eyes flicked toward the house. Your mother, he said. Jules went cold. For a moment, the world narrowed to the faint line of light under the back door, the flutter of the wash line, the smell of dust. Then Jules' anger rushed in like a tide. "Don't say her." Josh's voice softened. "I'm not trying to hurt you."
You are.
Jules said, and her voice cracked. "You don't get to ride into my yard and open the grave like it's a box you misplaced." Josh's shoulders sagged a fraction. He looked down at the thimble in his palm. "She made this," he said, almost to himself. "She made it for someone she cared about, and it never reached them." Jules stared at the thimble. She remembered her mother's hands, how they moved even when she was tired, how she'd patch a shirt like it mattered. Belinda's voice floated from the porch then, loud enough to reach them. "Jules, are you coming back inside, or are you letting him make a fool of you out there?" Jules' jaw clenched. Even now, Belinda couldn't stand not being at the center of it. Josh turned his head slightly, listening, then looked back at Jules. "I don't want to put you against your sister." Jules let out a brittle laugh. "You already did." Josh's eyes hardened with something like regret. "Then let me do one thing right." He held out the letter again. Jules didn't take it. "What's in it?" Josh's gaze stayed on her face. "Words meant for your father." Jules' stomach twisted. "Why didn't you give it to him?" Josh's throat moved. "Because the men I was with told me not to, and because I was afraid." Jules' voice sharpened. "Afraid of what?" Josh's eyes lifted, and for the first time his steady calm looked like strain. "Afraid that if I brought it, I'd be the one to pay for the truth." Jules stared at him, trying to fit him into the shape of her life. The pieces didn't settle. "And marrying me," she said slowly, "that's supposed to fix what you didn't do?" Josh shook his head. "No, because if the truth comes out, Red Willow will turn on whoever it can reach, and if you're alone, they'll reach you first." Jules's chest tightened. "So this is protection." Josh didn't deny it. He didn't soften it. He just said, "It's one reason." Jules' eyes stung, and she refused to let tears win. "And the other reason?" Josh looked at her hands, calloused, ink-stained from ledgers, raw from work, and then back to her face. "The other reason," he said quietly, "is that you're the only person I've met in this town who doesn't treat kindness like a bargain." Jules' throat worked. She wanted to believe him. She did. But Belinda's voice echoed in her head. "Don't embarrass yourself." And Josh had talked to Belinda first. Jules took a step back. "You don't know what you're asking." Josh's face tightened. "I know it won't be easy." "You're asking to marry into a family that's already cracked," Jules said, voice low. "And you're carrying the hammer." Josh didn't move. "Old. Then let me carry it." Jules shook her head once, hard. "No." "No to what? The marriage? The truth?" Jules's voice broke against her will. "No to being used to settle a debt you're tired of carrying." Josh's face went still, as if she'd struck him. "I'm not using you," he said. "You are," Jules whispered, and hated herself for how much it hurt to say it. "You picked me because you think I'll accept anything. Because you think I'm grateful for being chosen." Josh's jaw tightened. "That's not." But Jules raised a hand, stopping him. "If you have something to say to my father, say it to him." She turned toward the house before she lost her nerve. Behind her, Josh's voice followed, rough. "Jules." She didn't stop. When she reached the porch, Belinda was waiting, eyes bright with victory she tried to hide under concern. "Well," Belinda asked softly, "did he charm you with his sad little story?" Jules' hands shook. She forced them to still. "He has something for father." Belinda's smile faltered just slightly. "Something?" Their father looked up from his pipe. "What is it?" Jules stepped aside. Josh came forward, hat in hand again, the letter held carefully like it could cut. "Mr. Henderson," Josh said, voice even, "this should have reached you a long time ago." "From who?" Josh hesitated. Just a breath. Jules felt it like thunder in the distance. Then Josh said, "From your wife." The porch went silent so fast it felt unnatural. Belinda's face drained of color. Their father's pipe lowered slowly, as if his hand had forgotten what it was holding. "My wife," he repeated. Not loud, not soft, empty. Josh held out the letter, and before her father could take it, Belinda stepped forward too quickly, reaching like she meant to snatch it away. "Don't," Jules said sharp. Belinda froze, eyes flashing. Why not? Because Jules suddenly understood something she hadn't understood before. Something cold and hard settling into place. Belinda wasn't just shocked. Belinda was afraid. And Jules realized, with a sick twist in her stomach, that the letter might not only explain the past, it might explain her sister. Belinda's hand hovered in the air for one small moment, caught between reaching and remembering she wasn't supposed to be seen reaching. Jules watched her sister the way you watched a storm that hadn't decided where to break. Their father's voice came low. "Belinda, step back." Belinda's fingers curled, then she forced them to relax. She tried to smile, but it didn't land right. "Father, I only meant, this is private." Josh didn't move. He held the letter steady, his hat still against his chest, as if he'd decided he'd rather be polite than safe. Mr. Henderson reached out slowly and took the envelope. Jules saw his thumb pause on the seal, not because he couldn't open it, but because opening it meant the past could still speak. He cleared his throat once and broke it. The paper inside was folded carefully, as if whoever wrote it believed neatness could keep a life from unraveling. Their father unfolded it with hands that weren't shaking. Yet his face was tight, like he'd been carrying something heavy so long he'd forgotten he could set it down. His eyes moved across the page. The porch light caught the lenses of his spectacles, and Jules couldn't read his expression through the glare. She could only read the way his shoulders lowered a fraction at a time, like a man realizing he'd been holding his breath for years. Belinda took a step forward. "Father, quiet," Mr. Henderson said, and it wasn't loud, but it was final. Josh looked at the yard, not at Belinda, not at Jules, like he'd learned long ago that watching a man's face while he reads is the quickest way to get punished for delivering truth. Jules's hands clenched at her sides. She hated waiting, but she hated not knowing more. Finally, their father's mouth moved without sound. Then he found his voice. "This." He swallowed once. "This was written the week before she died." Jules felt a tightness behind her ribs, sharp enough to make her blink. Mr. Henderson read again, slower now, as if he was trying to hear her voice in the lines. Then he looked up at Josh. "You," he said. Josh lifted his gaze. "Yes, sir." Henderson's eyes narrowed. "She mentions a boy. Not by name. A boy they used. A boy who ran messages." Josh's jaw tightened. "That was me." Belinda's voice rose, brittle. "This is ridiculous. How do we even know that letter is real?" Their father didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the ink, on the folds, on the small smudge near the edge that Jules recognized. Her mother always pressed the side of her hand to the page when she wrote, leaving that faint mark like a signature she didn't know she had. "It's real," Jules said quietly. Belinda's head snapped toward her. "Jules, you don't know." "I know her handwriting," Jules replied, and the calm in her own voice surprised her. Mr. Henderson took a slow breath and spoke, as if the words weighed more than the paper. "She wrote that the night of the barn fire wasn't an accident." Jules felt her stomach drop. The barn fire, the thing Red Willow had never stopped circling back to, like a dog returning to a bone. Mr. Henderson's voice stayed steady, but his eyes went glassy. "She wrote that someone meant to destroy the North Pasture records. She caught them trying to take the books." Jules's throat tightened. "The ledgers?" Their father nodded, eyes still on the letter. "She wrote they were hiding missing funds. Enough to ruin the ranch if it came out. Enough to ruin reputations. Enough to make a man desperate." Belinda's face had gone pale in a way Jules hadn't seen before. Not fainting delicate, not dramatic, just stripped. Mr. Henderson continued, slower. "She wrote she confronted the person. She begged them to stop. She wrote that she feared what would happen if the town learned." Jules heard the clock inside ticking, as if time had never cared about anyone's grief. Mr. Henderson's mouth tightened, and then she wrote this. He read the next line with a voice that cracked against his will. She said she hid the truth to protect her daughter. Jules's knees softened. She caught herself on the porch post, fingers digging into the wood. Belinda whispered, "What daughter?" Jules didn't look at her sister. She couldn't. Mr. Henderson lifted his eyes from the paper and stared at the dark beyond the yard. She wrote she believed Belinda was involved. He said, quiet and devastated. Not as the one who started it, but as the one who knew and kept quiet. Belinda's breath hitched. No. Mr. Henderson looked at her then. His gaze wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was wounded. Belinda shook her head quickly, like she could shake truth loose. I was a girl. Father, I didn't start a fire. No, Mr. Henderson said, voice flat. But did you know? I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what. I didn't know it would. I didn't know Mother would. Her voice broke. She covered it with anger. And you? Belinda snapped at Josh. You come here and act noble? You stayed quiet too. You brought it now because it suits you. Josh's jaw flexed. You're right about one thing. I stayed quiet. Belinda's eyes flashed. Why? Josh's voice turned rougher, honest in a way that didn't ask to be liked. Because I was afraid. Because men told me I'd be buried out past the cottonwoods if I opened my mouth. Because I was young and I chose myself. Jules flinched at the plainness of it. Josh looked at Mr. Henderson. But your wife, she didn't choose herself. She chose you. She chose your daughters. She wrote the truth down anyway. She asked me to deliver it if I ever found the nerve. Mr. Henderson's face tightened. And you waited years. Josh nodded once. Yes, sir. Silence spread. Then Mr. Benedict heard father. Henderson asked the question Jules had been too afraid to. Why now? He said. Josh's eyes flicked to Jules. Because I heard what they did to her, he said quietly. How the town speaks. How they look past her as if she's a stain on your porch. Belinda's lips pressed together, and for a moment Jules saw not a villain, but a woman cornered by her own pride. One who had built her whole safety on being adored. Josh's voice stayed calm, but it carried weight. I came to do what I should have done, to hand you the truth, and to stand beside the one who's been paying for a story she didn't write. Jules' throat burned. You don't get to decide what I've paid. Josh met her eyes. You're right, I don't. His shoulders lowered slightly. That's why I asked. Not because I think you'll say yes. Because I'm asking you to choose, freely. And if you say no, I'll still give the letter. I'll still tell what I know. Jules felt something in her chest loosen and tighten all at once. It was easier to be angry at a man who was only trying to protect his conscience. It was harder when he stood there ready to be refused without turning cruel. Belinda's voice came small. Father, you can't let this ruin us. Mr. Henderson looked at her for a long time. Ruin? He said quietly. Belinda, your mother died holding a secret that cut her in half. Jules lived under whispers that weren't hers. If you're worried about ruin, we've been living in it. Belinda's eyes filled, and she looked away quickly, as if tears were something she'd never needed before and didn't know how to wear. I didn't mean for Jules to carry it, she said, voice raw. I thought if she looked like the problem, folks wouldn't look too closely at the rest of us. I thought it kept Father safe. I thought it kept me safe. Jules swallowed hard. The confession didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief with a new name. Mr. Henderson's shoulders sagged. You were a child, he said, and then, softer. But you've been an adult for a long time. Belinda flinched. Jules found her voice low. Did you ever think of telling the truth? Every time I looked at you. Jules blinked, the sting behind her eyes turning hot. Then why didn't you? Belinda's answer came out with shame, plain as dirt. Because if I admitted it, I'd be the one they stopped smiling at. The honesty of it hurt more than any polished lie. Mr. Henderson folded the letter with care, as if folding it wrong might break what little remained. He looked at Jules. "I failed you," he said quietly. "I let the town decide. I let the easiest story win." Jules shook her head once, because she couldn't carry his guilt, too. "You were trying to keep us fed, trying to keep the ranch standing." "That's not an excuse," he said, and his voice caught. "It's just the truth." A wind moved through the yard, tugging the wash line. For a moment, the night felt close and private, like the world had stepped back to let their family finally speak. Then, faintly, voices drifted from the street, neighbors passing, laughter, the ordinary life of Red Willow continuing as if nothing had shifted. Jules felt suddenly exposed. They're going to talk. Henderson nodded. "Let them." Belinda's eyes widened. "Father." Henderson cut her off gently but firmly. "No more hiding. Not behind Jules. Not behind your smile. Not behind silence." Belinda's chin trembled. "You'll cast me out." Mr. Henderson's face tightened. "I'm not casting you out, but you're going to make it right." Belinda swallowed. "How?" "You'll tell Jules you're sorry," he said. "And you'll speak the truth where it belongs, not in whispers." Belinda looked at Jules like she was seeing her for the first time without the town's approval standing between them. "I am sorry," Belinda said, and the words came awkwardly, like she'd never had to practice them. "I'm sorry I let you take it. I'm sorry I chose my comfort over your name." Jules stared at her sister, feeling something shift. The hurt didn't disappear, but it stopped being lonely. Jules's voice came out quiet. "Thank you for saying it." Belinda blinked fast, as if that kindness was harder to accept than blame. Mr. Henderson turned to Josh. "You did wrong," he said. Josh nodded once. "Yes, sir." "And you came back, Mr. Henderson continued, "knowing you'd be hated." Josh swallowed. "I came back knowing I deserved whatever came." Mr. Henderson studied him. "Why ask to marry Jules?" Josh's eyes moved to Jules again, careful, steady. "Because if she's willing, only if she's willing. I want to be the kind of man who doesn't stand aside anymore. I want to be the kind of man who chooses what's right even when it costs." Jules felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. Father, sister, and the man holding his breath like it was a vow. Jules's pride rose up, stubborn as ever, but beneath it was something else. A tired longing to be chosen without being pitied, to be seen without being judged. First, she looked at Josh. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "I won't be your penance." Josh's voice was quiet. "I don't want you to be. I won't be your shield," she added. "Or your proof you've changed." Josh nodded, as if he'd been waiting to hear that. "Good." Jules's throat tightened. "And if I say no?" Josh's eyes didn't waver. "Then I'll still tell what I know. I'll still do the right thing." That, more than any pretty promise, settled Jules' heart. She took a long breath. Then she said, "I'll court you first." Belinda made a startled sound, half laugh, half disbelief. Josh's face softened, not into triumph, but into relief he didn't try to hide. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and his voice shook just a little. Mr. Henderson looked like he might argue. Then he simply nodded once, as if accepting that life was finally moving in a direction he couldn't control. "Courting," Mr. Henderson said, firm, proper.
Josh dipped his head.
Proper. Belinda wiped at her cheek quickly, angry at herself for crying. Angry at herself for crying. "Of course she says that," she muttered, but there was no bite left in it, only the dull ache of consequence. Jules turned toward the yard, needing air. Josh followed, but he didn't touch her. He stopped a respectful distance away, like he understood that trust wasn't a thing you grabbed. "You're still angry," he said. Jules let out a quiet breath. "Yes." Josh nodded. "You should be." Jules looked at him then, truly looked. "You'll be the most talked about man in this town," she said. Josh's mouth pulled into something close to a smile. "I've been talked about before." "And you'll stay?" Jules asked, and she hated how small the question sounded. Josh's voice came steady. "I'll stay." Weeks later, Red Willow did what towns always did. It talked itself hoarse. Some folks softened when Mr. Henderson stood in church and spoke plainly about his wife's letter, about the old fire, about the way blame had been placed where it was convenient. He didn't name names with cruelty. He didn't ask for pity. He asked for decency. Some people gave it. Some didn't. Belinda did what she'd been told to do. She spoke truth where it belonged. She apologized where she could. She learned, slowly and painfully, what it felt like to walk through a room without everyone reaching for her smile. And Jules found herself sitting on the boarding house porch some evenings with Josh, not holding hands yet, not making a show, just talking. About work, about weather, about the ache of carrying things alone. The first time he laughed at something she said, truly laughed, surprised by it, Jules felt her own mouth lift before she could stop it. The smile startled her more than his proposal had. By winter, their courting wasn't a rumor anymore. It was simply true. And when Josh asked again, this time without an audience, without a town watching for a stumble, Jules answered without shaking. "Yes," she said, "yes, if we build it honest." They married in a small ceremony, with more quiet than spectacle. Her father cried once and didn't apologize. Belinda stood at Jules's side, hands clasped, eyes red, trying to be worthy of the place. Life didn't become perfect. Josh still had days where guilt sat heavy on him. Jules still had days where old whispers echoed in her head. But now, when those days came, there was someone in the next room. Someone who didn't demand she be bright to be loved. Spring returned. The ranch held steady. And in time, the Henderson house filled with new sounds, soft, stubborn, living sounds, like the world itself had decided to forgive them a little. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the fence line, Jules stood on the porch with a baby against her shoulder, Josh's hand resting lightly. Belinda sat on the steps, making faces at the little one until Jules laughed and told her to stop. Josh leaned in and murmured, "They were wrong about you." Jules looked out at the road where dust lifted and settled, where the town still moved with its own opinions. "I know," she said. Then she turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes. "And so were you," she added, a small smile tugging at her mouth. Josh's smile came slow. "I've never been so glad." The wind moved through the yard, gentle now, like it finally had nowhere else it needed to be. If this story found you in a quiet moment, I'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from? It's always something special to imagine how far a frontier town like Red Willow can travel. And if there's anything you'd like improved, pacing, characters, themes, or the kind of endings you enjoy, tell me what you'd suggest.